Midterm Part One, SSC 1002. My name is Brittany Babin, and this is due March 4th, 2019. For Part 1, I've chosen to do a YouTube audio, obviously, and this is the link below that you've already clicked on, and there's a script to follow along with my thoughts and my opinions on the podcast I've listened to for this part of the assignment. And later on into the audio, you will hear about my response to 5 questions I was asked based on my findings and opinions on morality and different countries. Prompt 1, response. Script. First, I'm going to introduce the podcast and whether I believe it's worth listening to. So here it goes. Out of the 2 options we got to choose from, I chose to do this part of the assignment on the first option, which was a podcast called Morality. This podcast was produced by Jad Abumrad and Robert Krulwich, which I may have pronounced wrong, and was published on December 10th, 2017 on YouTube. This documentary was about how we, as humans, have morality, and it's because we have it pre-programmed in our brains. It shares a few stories that convince you that it's biologically programmed into our minds to live with some empathy. I would recommend this to others as I found it very interesting, and I feel as though it puts things into perspective that sometimes we don't think about. It makes you realize that the human brain is really so amazing and very intriguing to learn about. And in this podcast, they share several stories that all relate to feelings we have as young children and how they stay consistent into adolescence. They talk about how we remember things from when we were children that continued to stay as lifelong lessons in our minds for future situations. Essentially, why we do what we do. Next, I'll describe the general purpose of the podcast. And I believe that the purpose of this podcast is to show us that we have morals naturally embedded in our brains that come from our ancestors. In the podcast, they tell a story about a little boy who fell into an area where an ape was. And the ape actually picked up the little boy and rubbed his back and brought him to where the humans could get him, at which time they brought him to safety. This just shows us that we have a long history of having feelings that we don't want to cause harm to other living things or feel bad when we do. In another area of the podcast, it talks about how young children, only around 2 years old, have these morals as well because they don't want to hit people or see other people hurt. They also tell stories about 2 people who are now adults that have had experiences when they were children where they've hurt people and they still think about it and feel bad for it today and believe that it's made them who they are. It's amazing to see that we don't want to cause harm to others naturally, and this podcast explains that sometimes people think with more empathy and sometimes people think with more logic. Next, it asks what I enjoyed about the podcast, and I feel like I really did enjoy the podcast, and I found it very interesting to see how we come from this long line of being empathetic and compassionate towards others and their well-beings. We naturally want to help somebody when they're in danger or distress. Their studies in the podcast also interested me a lot to see how different areas of our brain light up to different scenarios. This allows doctors and those who can conduct these studies to see why we think the way we do and what areas of our brain we are thinking with to come up with the best case scenario. What did I dislike about the podcast? I disliked that some of the emotions I felt when thinking about what I would do in those situations, but learned a lot about critical thinking when trying to come up with my answer. What did the podcast teach me about morality? The podcast taught me about the theory that we naturally have these morals embedded into our brains that make us or that we use to make tough decisions with empathy and calculations as well. We've been using them for a long, long time, and this has helped humanity develop because without them, they don't believe we could have made it this far. I found that very cool. Overall, I found this podcast very interesting and I would recommend it to others. The questions they ask others to evaluate their responses keep you naturally asking yourself what you would do. Some of the questions are disturbing and are very what if experiences that you would never want to be in, but are interesting to think about. Some of the stories that people shared were also very interesting to hear. Overall, I enjoyed listening to this, and I stayed engaged throughout the whole hour of the podcast, and I would recommend it to others. Prompt to response. For the second part of this assignment, we were asked to complete a judging game where you need to decide what a self-driving car should do in a situation where there's an accident and someone has to die. And you have to choose who the self-driving car should kill. An example is if the car has to hit an elderly lady or a baby, and you choose who you believe it should hit if it had to choose. Another example is if a car should kill you and your fellow passengers or several pedestrians. Lastly, we were told to look at how different countries responded to this in regards to who they would save, whether it be the children, the elderly, the poor, the established and successful, the men, the women, or themselves and their passengers. Then we were asked the following questions, and this is how I responded. Were you aware that morality could be influenced by regional culture? I was aware that different countries have different beliefs and that it could have some influence on their morals, but I was not aware that they would be as different as they are. Some are very pro-saving children, and some led more towards saving elderly, whereas some sacrificed themselves to save others, and some saved others no matter what the circumstance was. We all had different opinions and morals, but it's interesting to see that cultures played a role in their decision. The next question is, how do the findings of this study compare to what you've learned in the podcast or documentary? So I found that the findings compare in the sense that they talk about making decisions that, first off, you hope you never have to make, and second off, that you have to make a hard choice about who dies and who lives. In the documentary or podcast, they told a story about the train tracks and another about a baby, where basically you need to make a hard decision to choose who lives and who dies. In one case, it was 5 men on the tracks or 1 man. In another case, it was your own baby or you in the village. I feel as though this self-driving car judging is very similar. Who will you hit? The old lady, the child, the obese, the fit, all the decisions that you have to make, or all the decisions that you hope you never have to make, but decisions that are hard and get you thinking. Next question I was asked, are there any universal morals that can be used to inform the development of artificial intelligence? In the YouTube video, they say that they've received this data from over 200 countries. Among all of us, we've stayed consistent with saving children, saving the greater number, and saving humans over animals. I would say that this is fairly universal if it stayed consistent all across the board. Which 2 countries did you select and how did they compare with one another? I chose Canada and the US to compare the two because I feel like we're always in friendly competition with our neighbors. I found that compared to other countries, these two were very similar with the responses. I found it funny too because stereotypes always talk about how Canadians are always reputable for being so nice at times, and Americans are known for being more arrogant or ruder than us. But the responses were pretty consistent. The next question is, how do you feel about contributing your data to this type of study? I would say I feel indifferent about contributing my data to the study. I understand that the study needs to collect data and use them for advancement of technology, but those decisions are hard to make. I hope I never have to buy a self-driving car that one day might decide to kill me instead of someone else. Sounds selfish, but I'll just drive myself. How's that? Thank you for listening, and now on to part 2. Talk to you soon.